I say it. You're thinking, I exercise, I walk, I take my yoga class, and I want you to keep doing all of that. I really do. But what I'm about to tell you is something that even my most active patients get wrong. And a landmark study published in Alzheimer's and Dementia, one of the most important journals in my field, confirmed it. The habit is sitting, not instead of exercising, but in addition to it. Researchers at Vanderbilt University's Memory and Alzheimer's Center followed 400 older adults over 7 years, tracking their movement with wrist monitors to get precise, objective data, not what people remembered doing, but what they actually did. The finding was striking. The participants who spent more hours sitting each day showed faster brain shrinkage and measurable mental decline over those 7 years. Even among the people who were meeting CDC guidelines for weekly exercise, read that again. Even if you exercise regularly, even if you hit your 150 minutes a week, the hours you spend sitting are still linked to accelerated brain atrophy. Why? What is actually happening? When you sit for prolonged periods, blood flow to the brain decreases. The vessels that supply oxygen and nutrients to your neurons, the microscopic capillaries that run through your prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, become less efficient. Inflammation increases in the brain tissue, and the connections between brain cells, what neuroscientists call synaptic density, begin to thin out. There's also a specific area of the brain that SIT's research points to with particular concern, the medial temporal lobe, the region that houses the hippocampus. A study using MRI scans examined how much time adults between 45 and 75 spent sitting each day, then compared that to the thickness of the medial temporal lobe. The people who sat longest tended to have a measurably thinner MTL, and thinning in that region is one of the earliest structural signs of memory impairment. Now, before I tell you the fix, I need you to understand one more piece of this. The Vanderbilt study also found that the damage from sitting was significantly worse in people who carry a particular gene variant called ApoE4, the gene most strongly associated with Alzheimer's risk. If that gene runs in your family, this habit is not a minor concern. It is a direct neurological hazard. The fix is not complicated, and it's not about exercising more. It's about interrupting your sitting. What the research consistently shows is that breaking up sedentary time, getting up for even 2 to 5 minutes every 45 minutes to an hour, preserves blood flow to the brain in ways that a single long workout cannot compensate for. Set a timer, stand up, walk to the kitchen, do 5 slow shoulder rolls, sit back down. That simple interruption pattern is a genuine act of brain protection. I call it the 50 minute rule with my patients. 50 minutes seated, then up for 5. Non-negotiable. Let me say something that I know might land uncomfortably for some of you. When my patients tell me they've been sleeping poorly for years, waking up at 2 a.m., trouble falling asleep, feeling tired in the afternoon but wide awake at night, and then they tell me it's fine. They've just always been that way. I understand, truly, because our culture treats sleep difficulty as a personality trait, not a medical issue. People wear it almost like a badge. I'm just a light sleeper. But I have to be honest with you because that's my job. I have seen what years of poor sleep does to a brain scan, and it is not fine. A landmark study from the University of California, San Francisco, surveyed approximately 600 adults about their sleep quality and then scanned their brains a decade later. What they found was that the participants who had the most difficulty sleeping had brains that were on average 2.6 years biologically older than those of people who slept well. Not cosmetically older, structurally older, with measurably more atrophy on imaging. 2.6 years of accelerated brain aging from sleep quality alone. And a separate large-scale study published in a Biomedicine that looked at nearly 27,000 people found the same pattern. Poor sleepers had brains that appeared significantly older than their chronological age on MRI. This study was conducted at Karolinska Institute, one of the world's leading medical universities, and the results were clear enough that the 2024 Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention formally identified sleep disorders as an emerging modifiable risk factor for dementia. So what is actually happening inside the brain during poor sleep that causes this? Here's the part I need you to understand, because it will change how you feel about sleep forever. While you sleep, specifically during the deep, slow wave phases of sleep, your brain activates a remarkable cleaning system called the glymphatic system. Think of it as the brain's drain. Channels open up and cerebral spinal fluid flushes through clearing out toxic waste proteins that accumulated during the day. The most important one is called amyloid beta, a protein that when it builds up and isn't cleared, forms the plaques that are the defining pathological feature of Alzheimer's disease. When you sleep poorly, that drain doesn't fully open. The amyloid doesn't get cleared, it accumulates. And over years and decades, that accumulation, night after night, of inadequate deep sleep is now understood to be one of the earliest triggers in the Alzheimer's process. This is the one that most of my patients have never heard from anyone, and it's the one I most urgently want you to take seriously. The fix begins with sleep hygiene, a phrase that has become so overused it's lost its weight. So, let me be specific. Keep your bedroom cool, 65 to 68 degree. Dim your lights an hour before bed. Not just the overhead lights, but your phone screen. Light tells your brain it's daytime, and it suppresses the melatonin your deep sleep depends on. And if you've been waking between 2 and 4 a.m. consistently for years, please, I'm asking you as your viewer, the way I would ask a patient, bring that to your doctor. That pattern can indicate issues that are treatable, and treating them matters more for your brain than almost anything else on this list. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. Not for me, but for yourself. Is there something in your life right now, something you carry every day that you would describe as ongoing worry? Not the acute stress of a crisis, but the background hum of it. Financial pressure, a difficult family situation, the care of an aging parent, or the slow grief of watching your own health become something you have to manage. Something that has been sitting in your chest for more than 6 months. Because that steady chronic state, what neuroscientists call HPA axis dysregulation, produces a hormone you've heard of, cortisol. In short bursts, cortisol is useful. It sharpens your focus, manages inflammation, helps your body respond to challenges. Acute stress, brief and resolved, can even stimulate the birth of new brain cells. But chronic stress, sustained, unrelenting, unresolved, does something entirely different. The hippocampus, your brain's memory center, contains more cortisol receptors than almost any other brain region. It is uniquely sensitive to the stress hormone and uniquely vulnerable to it when exposure is prolonged. A research review published in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience confirmed that elevated cortisol levels are directly correlated with smaller hippocampal volumes, and that this shrinkage was associated with measurably worse memory performance, even in otherwise healthy adults. The researchers noted that cortisol may serve not just as a biomarker of Alzheimer's risk, but as an early target for prevention. A study published in the journal Neurology measured cortisol in the blood of over 2,000 healthy middle-aged adults, checked their memory and thinking, and scanned their brains. The participants, particularly women who had higher cortisol levels, performed worse on cognitive tests, and over time showed greater brain volume loss. I want you to sit with that for a moment, particularly women. The neurological literature is increasingly clear that the stress burden that women carry, often silently, often for decades, is not without biological consequence. It is measurable. It shows up on scans. And here's the part that offers some hope. The damage from chronic cortisol elevation is to a meaningful degree reversible. Research on patients with Cushing's disease, a condition where the body produces extreme amounts of cortisol, showed that when cortisol levels came down after treatment, hippocampal volume actually increased again. The brain came back. So stress reduction is not self-indulgence, it is neurology. The fix I recommend to my patients is a practice I call cortisol bookending. 2 5-minute interventions, one in the morning and one before bed, that are specifically designed to bring the stress hormone down. In the morning, slow, deliberate nasal breathing for 5 minutes before you look at your phone. 4 counts in, 6 counts out. This activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and repair system, and research shows it measurably lowers cortisol within minutes. In the evening, write down 3 things that are not threats, 3 small, genuine things that went well or that you're grateful for. Not because positivity fixes everything, but because the act of deliberate, non-threating actively downregulates the HPA axis. These are not wellness cliches, they are mechanisms. Now, here's the 4th habit, and I want to introduce it carefully because I know food is complicated. I know that changing what you eat feels overwhelming, and I know that the word diet alone makes many of my patients close down. So, let me be precise about what I'm talking about because this is not about being on a diet. This is about one specific category of food and what peer-reviewed neuroiming research shows it does to the physical structure of your brain. The category is ultra-processed food, and before you think you know what that means, let me tell you how scientists actually define it. Ultra-processed foods are not simply things that are unhealthy or high in calories. They are foods that have been manufactured through industrial processes to the point where they no longer resemble their original ingredients and where substances are added, emulsifiers, artificial flavors, preservatives, colorings that you would never find in a home kitchen. This includes obvious things, packaged chips, soft drinks, fast food, but it also includes things that feel healthier, flavored yogurt, packaged bread, even whole grain bread with a long ingredients list, flavored nuts, most cereals, many protein bars. And here is why I'm bringing this up as a brain shrinkage issue, not just a general health issue. A major study published in 2024 in Neurology, again one of the most rigorous journals in my specialty, followed over 14,000 adults and found that every 10% increase in ultra-processed food as a share of daily diet was associated with a 16% increased risk of cognitive impairment. A separate data set in the same research showed that higher UPF intake was linked to increased stroke risk as well. And a 2023 study published in JAMA Neurology, the flagship journal of the American Academy of Neurology, tracked nearly 11,000 people over 8 years and found that higher ultra-processed food consumption was associated with a higher rate of decline in both global cognition and executive function. But here is the detail that stays with me most, the one I keep coming back to. Longitudinal data from the RAIN study found that high ultra-processed food diets were linked to a 5% reduction in hippocampal volume, specifically even after controlling for cardiovascular risk factors. 5%. That is not a rounding error. That is measurable structural loss of the brain's most critical memory region. How does food do this to the brain? The mechanism runs through 3 channels. First, ultra-processed foods promote gut dysbiosis. They disrupt the delicate microbiome in your digestive system. And the gut and the brain are in constant communication through what scientists call the gut-brain axis. When the gut is chronically inflamed, so is the brain. Second, these foods drive systemic inflammation and insulin resistance, and the brain is acutely sensitive to both. Third, they are largely stripped of the fiber, omega-3 fatty acids, antioxidants, and B vitamins that the brain genuinely needs for structural maintenance. It's not just what these foods add that's harmful, it's what they crowd out. The fix is not perfection, and I want to be clear about that. A Harvard Medical School neurologist told the research community something important. Even modest reductions in ultra-processed food intake are associated with meaningful improvements in brain health outcomes. This is not about eating nothing but salmon and leafy greens from this moment forward. It's about reading 1 label a day. It's about the Mediterranean diet principle, not a rigid protocol, just a preference for whole foods, olive oil, fish, legumes, vegetables, and nuts, which the research links to a 30% lower risk of Alzheimer's. Start with one swap, one thing you eat regularly that you could exchange for something closer to its natural form. That's it. One swap sustained over months is real neuroproction. Let me bring all 4 of these together because I don't want you walking away with 4 separate anxieties and no clear sense of what to actually do. I want you to think of what I've described today as a framework that I call the brain shield routine, not a rigid schedule, but 4 daily commitments, one for each of the habits we talked about. The first commitment, the 50-minute rule. Every 50 minutes seated, stand for 5. Set an alarm on your phone. Make it automatic. The second commitment, sleep is medicine. Protect your sleep with the same seriousness you'd protect any medical treatment because that's exactly what it is. It's your brain's nightly maintenance protocol. Cool room, dimmed light, and if your sleep is persistently disrupted, don't accept it as normal. Third commitment, cortisol bookending. 5 minutes of slow breathing in the morning before screens. 3 things that are not threats written down before bed, every day. Not when you feel stressed every day, because cortisol builds quietly before you notice it. Fourth commitment, one whole food swap. Not a new diet, just one conscious replacement each day. One food you normally reach for that you exchange for something your brain can actually use. None of these are dramatic. None of them require equipment or money. They require only awareness, which is why I made this video, because once you know, you can't unknow it. And once you start acting on it, the research suggests your brain will respond. I want to tell you about a woman I'll call Carol. She came to see me when she was 63 years old. She'd retired the previous year after 30 years as a high school librarian, one of the most intellectually engaged professions I know. She was sharp, well-read, and deeply concerned about one specific thing. In the past 18 months, she'd been blanking on the names of books she'd recommended hundreds of times, authors she loved, titles that felt like old friends. They were disappearing. What struck me in that first appointment wasn't the symptom. It was what she told me about her life since retirement. She'd stopped working, which meant she'd stopped walking to the bus stop every morning, stopped standing in the stacks for hours, stopped the constant, low-grade intellectual engagement of helping students find what they were looking for. She'd started sitting more, a lot more. She was watching television in the evenings and struggling to fall asleep, lying awake, worrying about small things, money, her adult son, the state of the world. She'd been eating differently too. Her husband had passed away the year before she retired, and she'd found herself reaching for convenience foods she'd never kept in the house when she was cooking for 2. When I looked at her brain scan, I wasn't surprised by what I saw. There was measurable hippocampal atrophy, not severe, not the profile of Alzheimer's, but real. Her brain had aged faster than her chronological age should have allowed. Here's what I want you to hear. Carol's story is not a tragedy. Carol walked out of my office with a very specific set of changes. She started a walking club with 2 neighbors 3 mornings a week. She set an alarm on her watch during the hours she spent reading that reminded her to stand and stretch every hour. She saw a sleep specialist, was diagnosed with something called sleep maintenance insomnia, and treated it. Her brain on a scan 2 years later showed slowed atrophy, not reversal, but measurably slower progression. Carol told me something at that second appointment that I've never forgotten. She said, "I feel like I got my reading back. That's why I do this work. Not because I can promise every patient a perfect outcome, but because I've seen enough Carols to know that what you do between now and 5 years from now is not irrelevant. It is everything." I want to ask you a question before you close this video, and I hope you'll answer in the comments below because I genuinely want to know of the 4 habits we talked about today: the sitting, the sleep, the chronic stress, the processed food. Which one felt the most personal? Which one made you pause and think that's me? Tell me in the comments. Be honest. You don't have to have everything figured out. I read every comment on this channel, and I want to hear your answer. And if this video was useful to you, consider sharing it with someone you love who's in this same season of life. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for the people we care about is hand them information they didn't know they needed. Before you go, I need to say something that I mean genuinely, not as a formality. Everything I've shared in this video is based on current peer-reviewed neuroscience research and my own 20 years of clinical experience. It's general medical education, the kind of information I wish every patient walked in already knowing. It is not a substitute for your personal medical care. If you are experiencing changes in your memory or cognition that worry you, please don't sit with that worry alone. Don't wait for it to become undeniable before you make an appointment. Make the appointment now while the conversation is still early enough to matter most, because that is not a formality. That is genuine advice from someone who has seen what happens when people wait too long and who is rooting deeply professionally, personally, for you to still be watching this channel 10 years from now